All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's nice to have a full house. This is our second last lecture of the fall semester, and there's another lecture next Thursday that I would encourage everyone to attend. Tonight we're lucky enough to have Angie Co. Angie's work is now hung in the level gallery on levels 1, 3, and 4. So that was going up today, so it's worth checking that out, and we can maybe take a walk as a group after the lecture. And the reason for that is that's part of our new tradition that the critical practice, or critical practitioner, Angie was teaching critical practice this summer. And I think it was really exciting because Angie has I would say a kind of interesting background. She has 2 bachelor's degrees from Penn, one in computer science and architecture. And then she also attended Columbia for her MArch. So she's got a background in terms of thinking about technology as well as design, and I think that makes her uniquely suited to be leading that summer class that we just had this summer. Angie's a registered architect in the state of New York, certified passive house consultant, and a LEED accredited professional as well. And I guess we can also say that if anyone needs AIA continuing education credits tonight, we can also do that. Angie Co is an architect, designer, and teacher, committed to the belief that architecture has the capacity to shape both individual experience and collective understanding. She's the founder of Studio Co Architecture, a design practice concerned with transforming everyday life at a range of scales, including furniture, buildings, and urban design. Her research into engaging inhabitable things and their effects on space, bodies, and perception has been supported by the American Academy in Rome, the MacDowell Colony, the Institute for Public Architecture, and the I-Beam Institute. And some of that work you can also see in the inflatables that are hanging on the fourth floor, on the fourth floor. So with that, I want to say welcome to Angie, and then we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So welcome, Angie.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay. It is so great to be here again, and I would like to offer my thanks to Dean Dobman for the invitation and for all of the faculty and students here. I was here over the summer as the critical practitioner teacher, the master critical practitioner teacher, and it was a really amazing summer program for me. As Carl said, I just wanted to point out that if anyone does need AIA credits, you can get some for being at this lecture. And I just want to look back really briefly on the summer, as that was a really formative time for me as well. And I'd like to thank Philip Plowright, who's over here, who was my collaborator over the summer. He was wonderful to work with. And so these are a couple of shots of the final event, which was an exhibition. The brief that I had put together is called Figuring Worlds, Characters, Models, and Prototypes. And I thought it might be helpful to talk about it briefly because my own work is oftentimes structured in this way and is based very heavily on figuring. So these are, there were 5 different teams, a variety of work. It was really, in many ways, open-ended. So the whole summer, we looked a lot at games, we looked a lot at techniques, but in the end, a lot of the final development of the project was also contingent on the various team members. So one of the things that I like to think about when thinking about characters, models, and prototypes is that they're a way to envision the world. And by thinking about the narratives between them, you can stitch together understandings of reality. So just really briefly, the exhibition, I thought I'd talk about. This is my own exhibition, which opened today. And it's also structured in a way in terms, can you guys see the mouse? No, you can't. Well, the bottom level are models. They're design models. These are mostly material models and are fragments that can become larger projects. And these models start out being siteless, scaleless, and totally program-free, but then can be applied to different situations as a kind of thought exercise in exploring architectural ideas. On the third floor, there's a kind of prototype wall, which is a full-scale mock-up of one of the projects called Kentucky Crossings, which I'll also present today. And then on the fourth floor is a series of images of installations of balloons or inflatables that I've made at a variety of scales and in a variety of contexts. So really briefly, this summer program that I did, Figuring Worlds, Characters, Models, and Prototypes, a lot of it is based on a process. And this is an art piece by Kent Rogowski called, it's part of a series called Love Equals Love. And what I think is really nice about this collage is that it's a collage with puzzle pieces. And if we think of figuring as something that's oftentimes not, the end results aren't planned, it is a puzzle to fit together certain elements. But what Kent Rogowski is doing here is actually constructing new and fantastical landscapes and characters out of very banal pieces. So the shape itself is the thing that enables these images to be created. And thinking about profiles, you can think about animal profiles and fitness. So this is an image of Charles Darwin's Galapagos finches, drawn by John Gould in 1845. And here, the fit between the profile and the thing that it represents is very particular. So in this image, Darwin was beginning to parse that finches were actually a series of different species, and the shape of their bill could help determine or help understand their environment and how they are actually different entities. So this idea of the bill being a profile that is operative. Another image, this is John James Audubon, Birds of America. And he is one of the foremost illustrators of wildlife. But what Audubon did, which was quite different from other naturalists, was that he not only illustrated the animals with great precision, but he put them in their environment. And he put them also oftentimes doing behavior that's typical to their species. So this is an image of the great American shrike, which is also called the butcher bird. And in thinking about the beak and the shape of the beak, the butcher bird, even though it's a small songbird, is a predator and it preys on insects, rodents, and small birds. But because it's so small, the butcher bird oftentimes uses its environment. So this is a hawthorn tree, and if you think of the sharpness of the beak, the tree also has thorns, and one of the things the bird is quite famous for is impaling its prey to either save it as a kind of, the tree becomes a pantry of sorts for future consumption, or at times to even fully kill the prey, because the prey is oftentimes almost as large as the bird itself. So sharpness being a quality that performs in particular ways. This is an image that I really love. It's from the Rochester Bestiary, which is an illuminated medieval tome, which a bestiary is basically a compilation of animals. And those animals are both real and fantastical. But bestiaries oftentimes tell stories with the animals that often have a kind of allegorical or moral story. This, in thinking of the sharpness, I found this quite humorous, that the hedgehogs, which have sharp quills all over their body, the medieval understanding of these hedgehogs is that those quills, the purpose of those quills is to stick a bunch of grapes, because hedgehogs love grapes. So they roll around in fields of grapes, they pick up all of these grapes, and they return to their burrow to feed their young. So when thinking about the profile of an animal and the constructive aspect of a profile, another source of inspiration is a series of drawings and art from northwestern Native American peoples. And this is a drawing called Split Beaver by Robert Davidson, who's from the Haida tribe. And in a lot of their iconography, the animals are iconic, but they're also poetic or metaphorical. So this split beaver is shown in frontal elevation, but then it's also doubled on each side elevation. So you have this kind of double profiling, and the figure and the ground aspect of the image also come into play. So there's multiple, it's a kind of visual punning, and each image actually has a lot of ways of interpreting it. So from that, I want to start with a project, which is something that we also explored this summer. It's a project called Critters, which is about animals and is about profiling. Critters is an investigation into the logic of form and the ways in which it might imply behaviors and environments. So each critter is an object bounded by two animal profiles that are semblances of actual animals reduced to simple geometries. So in this image here, on your right, you can see obliquely there is a profile of a rabbit, and on the left there is a profile of an elephant. In each case, two profiles are projected upon each other, resulting in a form that is both logical and evocative, a cross between Boolean operations and Boolean cubes, or the geometry of logic and the geometry of flavor. So. Oh, sorry, this is a video, but it doesn't seem to be playing. Let me just. Oops, sorry. Well, we can discuss it. This is a rabbit with two dispositions. There is something double about its nature from every angle other than the normal one. It is, in this case, you can see the two profiles are a rabbit standing and a rabbit running. So when looking at these critters, we can discern appendages, note their relative positions, observe their shapes, and speculate on their implications. What are the defining characteristics? How does it fit into its environment? And what are the relationships between its form, its internal and external forces? So this critter here, you can see, has bilateral symmetry along an oblique axis. It has 3 arms, 3 heads, and 1 foot. The heads join with the body at a point just above the animal's tail. The single flat-shaped sled foot indicates that locomotion may be difficult for this animal. This animal possesses no symmetry. It has 1 arm, 2 legs, and 2 skis. One side of the body is larger and more developed than the other. It seems to be able to move in 2 ways, obliquely hopping and obliquely sliding. And here you can see that on this side, on your left side, there's a silhouette of a kangaroo, and on the right, there's a silhouette of a rabbit. This animal possesses a vague bilateral symmetry. Its head is a broad wedge that terminates in an equally wide chisel beak. The animal is long-bodied and short-legged. Its balance and dexterity likely augmented by a posterior rudder cape. Okay. So I'm sorry, these videos actually aren't playing. Let me see if I could. This is a critter that is actually developed on 3 axes. So it has 3 Boolean intersections. And here you can see that it's this kind of combinatorial form and an ambivalent object. In terms of other ambivalent objects, this is a combination of 2 forms. I call the project Furniture Hills because it's a combination of furniture and hills. And this is the kind of composite that we get, this strange landscape character. And it's made by embedding furniture profiles within these small landscape features. And this is a bed in a hill. And as a whole series, there are a variety of different furniture shapes combined with a variety of environments. So, for example, we have a bench combined with prairie. We have a sitting lounge combined with grass. This is clover with a twin-sized bed and lawn with another twin-sized bed. This is 2 back-to-back chairs, kind of seesaw chairs, combined with clover. And here we have meadow with a chaise longue and an upright chair. This one's another variety of chair with lavender. So in thinking of traversing this landscape of uses as well as environments, you can think of almost domestic programs with the scents and the textures and these different kinds of sitting profiles that either enable you to engage with other people or be more secluded. Okay, so traversing a landscape, this is another project. It's called Kentucky Crossings. And this project was for a series of crosswalks in Kentucky, in Lexington, Kentucky. There is a trail called the Legacy Trail that's a nature and cultural walk that also skirts a variety of landmarks and crosses the road in a variety of places. So the commission for this project was to develop and design a series of crosswalks for intersections. And the trail, as you can see here, the trail wends through around a number of features, and these are all of the crossings. So there are a whole series across this 8-mile trail, and the brief was originally to just create one design that would be implemented on all of the intersections, but I thought it would be really nice to think of how to make a variety of crossings using similar principles. So the technical aspect, basically, I had to deal with newly rolled asphalt and permanent crossings that are basically embossed into the ground, and a kind of thermoplastic that then is steamrolled over to fuse the thermoplastic in these embossed tracings into the ground. So thinking about the constraints of the design, I designed a series of die cuts, one being a matrix, which on its own kind of resembles a tree, but in combination starts to look a little bit like roads, as well as trees or railroads, all of which are elements that the trail goes over. I also looked at Kentucky icons. So the cardinal is the state bird, and the gray squirrel is the state animal, and the viceroy butterfly is the state insect. So I distilled these characters into iconic shapes to fit within triangular die cuts. And so the dies, you can see they can be mirrored. And then also these elements on the right are the templates for embossing. So in order to get it a little bit more efficient, we had to be able to reuse a number of the embossing templates and be able to reconfigure them to produce a whole variety of crosswalks. So the idea is that the different characters or the animals exhibit different behaviors and can combine in different ways. So these are some of the individual crosswalks. Here you have cardinals with squirrels, squirrels that go into rounds, which is one of the kind of behaviors that I've, design behaviors I've given them, butterflies that start to form Vs, butterflies with birds, cardinals that flock, and then all of the animals together in different combinations. So these crosswalks are graphic. You know, they're understandably crosswalks. They use the same materials, they're similar dimensions, but in a way they also allude to the ability of choreographing flows of different speeds and also different species. Another project for choreographing flows is one that I like to think of as a kind of active ground. And this, in a way, you know, if you think of a free plan being a plan in which anything can happen because the structure is very regular as a grid and it takes up all of the load, this is thinking materially about a concrete system that is a slab but is a kind of formed slab. And on that slab, it's not really a free plan, but a kind of free form plan. So here, it seems to trace movements and moments of stasis, and in the moments of stasis, there are opportunities for things like structure or potentially furniture. And so this is, the next two projects I'm going to show are more material projects. These projects you can see on the first floor of the level galleries. And they're kind of seed projects. So they're projects that I think of as material systems that can be applied in a lot of different ways or to specific contexts, but I'll show you some of their instantiations, but are kind of more open-ended material projects. So in thinking about the slab and thinking about material and the casting process, one of the tools that I developed was a way of casting these pieces in modules. And so this is a kind of basic module that makes a tile, and the tiles are kind of like jigsaw puzzles, or they're kind of like dominoes in the sense that they have either open flows or closed flows. And this is a whole combination of the flows that you can then start to piece together to create a variety of landscapes and flows. Now, the use of this is sort of open-ended, and the way in which I thought about it was also in terms of different speeds or different open-ended uses. I thought of different scales, so potentially an urban scale, and also thinking about the material matrix of it and the composition of all of what would be, you know, what I originally cast as concrete, thinking that it might actually be something that can degrade, deteriorate, and evolve, potentially even spring plants. So the prototype for this, I really thought of it being most applicable as a kind of garden where the landscape and the design is more free-flowing and open-ended. So this kind of material model is a project that I think of as materializing program, meaning that the program isn't fully prescribed. You don't have like a set brief for the program, but the program and the form or the materiality go hand in hand and kind of imply, the material can start to imply certain uses. So another materializing program model that I created, which is also a concrete study, is one that I call oblique holes. And this one, instead of being a ground system, is more of a wall system. So in this project, there are a series of modules, and there aren't any windows or doors that are punched, but there's basically a series of shapes that are projected through the wall brick. And so here you can see they go in different directions, and this is the shape of their projection. So as a system, I tried it with a variety of different molds, and the variables of this kind of material system include scaling the modules, rotating the apertures, and using the projected voids of the apertures to shape interior program. So we can think about these interior projected forms as being kinds of frontal visibility or framed views. And so the obliqueness of some of the openings can make for either a lot of concentrated visibility in certain areas where maybe more public programs would go, or in certain areas, zones that might be completely blind to a clearly framed view, which might lend itself to darker programs or more autonomous programs like a performance space. So this is a kind of prototype of a speculative building that deals with materializing program. And another way in which I think about program and materials is programming materials. So this is, on the fourth floor, there are a series of images of inflatables. This is actually the very first balloon that I made. It's not displayed because in a way it doesn't fit the kind of series that's displayed on the fourth floor. But I want to present it because it was the kind of seed project for a lot of things, or for a lot of the inflatable projects. This was commissioned by the I-Beam Institute for Art and Technology in New York. And it's a project called the Weather Making Balloon, which was a collaboration with an art and technology firm based in LA called AOLab. And what we did was we looked at using this balloon foil. It's a kind of metallized thermoplastic, which was actually developed by NASA during the Cold War as a kind of technology for the space industry. And it's a really ubiquitous material now, and we think of it as party balloons, but in terms of balloons also oftentimes collect data, like weather monitoring balloons. So this balloon was, in a way, it was at this large event, and we wanted to create this kind of float that could provide a canopy for open-ended activity, but was also interactive. So one of the things about the metallized skin is that it conducts electricity. So we used the whole balloon as a kind of open wire and had a few things like a strobe and sound connected to it, as well as a kind of surveillance camera within the balloon. So it had all of these tethers that you could grab onto. People just love to grab balloons, but they're very delicate. So we had to make all of the chambers for air be separate, so a lot of them could pop, like all of these tethers in half an hour were completely popped. But the metal on the outside was all continuous. So when you grabbed two tethers, you would complete the circuit with your body, because your body also conducts electricity, and that would trigger the balloon to basically strobe and make thunder sounds, or these kinds of discordant noises. So here's two people that you could string together a number of people to make the balloon go. But also the balloon and these events, even more so now, everyone is taking photos of all of these events. So the flash from a camera also triggers the balloon to take a series of basically surveillance images. So these are a series of photos that the balloon was just taking as people were going about their business, squeezing and popping tethers and carrying on with revelry. And so this was the very first balloon project. And even though I didn't really pursue the material electrical property of the balloon, I became really interested in this kind of soft and puffy form. And I had the really good fortune to be able to spend some time at a place called the McDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is an amazing place where all kinds of artists can gather and have time and space to work. And you have your own studio. This was my studio. It was an old building. It was just for me. It's where I did all of my work. And you eat together with the artists, and they bring you your lunch so that you can kind of continue to work in this haven environment. environment filled with nature. So one of the things that I explored there, and this was kind of a self-initiated project, was other kinds of puffy balloon forms. And so I was interested in the spatial qualities, but also this excessive materiality and this dimpled form, and the ability for these floats, like party floats or objects, to be both interior and exterior, and the ways in which you might engage them. So I'm going to show in kind of quick succession a series of these floats. This was the one that I made in New Hampshire, but it also traveled, and I brought it to Kentucky and explored it outside and the ways in which you might engage it. So you might be inside it, taking it through buildings. And, you know, again, because balloons are like so fragile, this balloon, like, I'm surprised it was even able to last 2 cities. And, you know, it popped like also shortly after moving it around this building. But then I made a series of other balloons that started to enclose space. And this is at a gallery in Kentucky called the Land of Tomorrow Gallery. So more balloons. I wanted to go bigger and explore kind of the extremes. The technology itself is actually kind of both high-tech and low-tech. I make all of these balloons myself, and this is a large installation in Montpellier, which is a medieval city in France. And every year there's this festival called the Festival of Lively Architectures, and I won the competition to go with a number of architects to do an installation. So the installation was this, the theme was encounter. And so I created this 19 or 17-foot diameter balloon disc that squeezes into this interior courtyard in Montpellier. And it's one that reorganizes the circulation in the courtyard and kind of fills the space. It's squeezed in diagonally. And it also, you know, it invites a gentle touch. So this is the plan and kind of diagram. Basically, most of the, you know, the construction I did all myself with basically one other person who helped me. And as I said, it's really kind of high-tech but low-tech. You know, you seal the foil with an iron, but you have to make sure that there are no holes in it, otherwise your balloon's just not gonna hold air. So it was a laborious process, and I thought it might be fun to kind of see how this thing, which is so nomadic and so lightweight, can be quickly and easily deployed. Basically, we just strung a wire and hung it. So all of the seams of the balloon are thermoplastic sealed, but we use just clear tape to make all of the hanging out, like all of the tabs for hanging it. And okay, so I talked a little bit about the MacDowell Colony, and this is a place that I also was very, very lucky to be able to go to. This is the American Academy in Rome. And what you can see is this campus on top of one of the hills in Rome, and I got to go there for 11 months as a fellow. The fellowship is for a series of artists, including architects, but also a series of scholars. So if you look on the right, the kind of right back pavilion of the, you know, orange building, this McKim Mead and White building, that was my studio. And, you know, the other pavilions in front of the building were for artists, designers, and visiting artists. So this is my studio, and my project in Rome was really to observe the city and to catalog a number of spatial elements. I was especially interested in Baroque spaces and Baroque techniques. And in this image, there are 2 projects that I'll show. One is this large table, and the other is this balloon dome. So the very first project I did in Rome was inspired by this incredible Italian designer named Enzo Mari. And this project is called Autopregazione, and it's basically a catalog of a series of furniture pieces that are very easy to make that you can make yourself using only simple tools, a saw, nails, a hammer, maybe 2 people. And so part of the idea, it translates to kind of auto-made or self-made, is that by making these things yourself, you're self-making, or you're kind of defining who you are. So I took one of the elements, which is this table, and transformed it into something very large called tavolone. And so using a number of the pieces and techniques, basically constructed a 3-module table that comes together, it sleeves together so that the pieces can support each other. And they basically step and groove together. So this large table was the working ground for the whole 10 or 11 months that I was in Rome. And here it is kind of peeking out of the studio. And one of the things about this table is that the detail for connecting them, you can see in this image, they basically dovetail together, but always going in. So there's kind of a maximum width and a minimum width, and I thought about those as the ends of this very large table, and this table being something that spans or bridges between different artists. In this case, my studio is on the right, and the artist Elliot Green was on the left. So this is the installation design, even though I really only made 3 of the table pieces. It would really be a 27-part table that would completely reorganize the circulation of the academy so that in order to even enter the building, you would have to go into one of our studios. And this kind of obstacle table would be this great platform for people to do whatever they wanted together. And this is a photo collage of how that might work. So Elliot is a really incredible artist, and he and I used to go to one of my favorite buildings in Rome, and probably some of many people's favorite building. This building, which Elliot loved to call the Villa Agrippa, because it's inscribed on the front, and the inscription says, I'm just going to read it, M. Agrippa LF Cos Tertium Fecit, which, a quick kind of online search says Marcus Agrippus, son of Lucius, 3-time consul, made this. But actually, he didn't make it. His Pantheon burned down like several decades prior, and this was actually the 3rd Pantheon built on the same site, and it was completed by the Emperor Hadrian. So this kind of misreading of the Pantheon is something I found very inspiring. And I also, when you go into the space, you recognize immediately that the interior is just so majestic and in a way exceeds the exterior of the building. So one of the things I was also doing in Rome, which was just an ongoing study, was trying to parse what it was about certain spaces that just made them so incredible, and then how to take those qualities and transform them or create other spaces using similar techniques or powers. So with the Pantheon, I think one of the amazing things is that the oculus is totally open to the elements. So here are the rains coming in, and here's the other opening to the Pantheon. So thinking of, this is the section of the Pantheon by John Soane, who did his own grand tour in Italy and in Rome and was very inspired by the Pantheon. And one of the kind of legendary qualities of the Pantheon is that it has this sphere, complete sphere inside it. So I decided to think about the sphere and to do a series of Pantheon transformations thinking about the sphere within the Pantheon. So what does a sphere enable? It enables rotation in all of these different directions. You can mirror along a sphere. It's a kind of perfect form. So what would that do if these transformed kind of Pantheon domes were part of the Pantheon? So I did a series of collages. This building is symmetric along a central horizontal plane. Its massing from the outside is a cylindrical form that meets both the ground and the sky with a rounded and terraced bowl. The inside is a hollow and coffered sphere. The building has no windows or doors and would be quite difficult to access by a human without extra equipment. This building is actually two buildings that are co-located but not accessible to each other. The outer building has an octastyle portico and is circular in plan. The ceiling above is a hemispherical bowl that touches down in the center of the circular plan. Both the oculus and the bottom drain are open to the elements. This building has a concave hemispherical bowl roof with a large drainage hole at its lowest point, which is exactly at grade. So part of this, basically dehistorying architecture may feel really wrong in certain ways. But I actually found it really liberating. I mean, again, I ostensibly went there to be looking at Baroque spaces, but I found Baroque techniques and qualities all over Rome and Italy, even outside of formally Baroque spaces. This is the Laurentian Library, which is a Baroque space, but the stair here is a figure in the space itself and transforms with each step and kind of slides and opens into the space. So it's not just a functional stair, but something much more. Other elements that I found so compelling, in Milan, the series of arcades that unite and create this kind of unified front for all of the buildings. So whether it's a church in the middle or a residential building on the left or the right or retail on the bottom, these arcades basically give a kind of grand pedestrian access and this united facade. So I did a series of catalogs, drawings, and photos that look at some of these elements. Also kinds of elements outside of regular typologies. So these are little vendors that are fit within each opening. I also looked at furniture. Churches were so interesting to look at because in many cases they are this very developed crust, but the interior is not walled or lobed more formally or more enclosed like some of the spaces we have. So things like a pew where the front is for sitting and the back is for kneeling, started to become really fascinating to me, and also thinking about how they're organized to make a kind of congregation. So the profile of this pew being both extruded and layered. I did a series of kinds of drawings that thought about making different kinds of congregations and space making only with these pews. Facing in different directions, making different shapes, again, pointing in different ways, either to the outside or the inside. Confessionals I found so fascinating. These really, the most intimate space in a way of a church where you're confessing to a priest. So again, a place for kneeling, kind of a covered area. And these furniture rooms basically scattered within larger umbrellas of space. So I did, some drawings, pulpits as stages, stairs with canopies, mini altars, kind of combined with columns, instruments that are either kind of the scale of furniture or the size of a room, creating this kind of roof. And so, but I always went back to domes and did a series of studies of domes, Pantheon, Tempietto, a number of Borromini domes. So on the left is San Carlo, and on the right is San Ivo. And thinking about these spatial units kind of estranged from their edifice and even estranged from their ideology. So what would it be like to kind of take off a dome and let it wander around? So I thought about making a series of balloon domes that basically untethering the dome from the edifice, and what would happen, what they could create, these kinds of rooms that could come down and enclose you, you could touch them, how you might translate the geometry of very intricate spaces. So this is kind of a basic diagram of San Carlo by Borromini, and thinking about how you might use some of the patterning of octagons and crosses to create this kind of tufted figure. So then I started thinking about urbanism, and if these domes were untethered, they could just go all over the city, which was very exciting. But I thought about how I might tether them actually to a kind of point, and I chose these obelisks, which come from antiquity, have been repurposed in many ways to signify different things in this kind of grand urban space. So this is St. Peter's Basilica, giant plaza in the front with this ancient Egyptian obelisk in the center that especially, again, it was kind of, there's a tradition of appropriating other forms, monumental forms, to kind of show your dominance over them or your ability to kind of be as great or integrate them into now your iconography. So the Baroque city, Rome is in many ways a Baroque city, and the planning of Baroque Rome by Pope Sixtus V is a fascinating urban endeavor where basically this Pope in the Counter-Reformation said, we need to inspire awe. We have a number of pilgrimage sites all over Rome, and we want to erect great monuments at each pilgrimage site and create these avenues between them to create this kind of star-shaped network of power in the city. So in many of these pilgrimage sites, an obelisk or a column was raised or transported. And so this network of balloon domes would be tethered to all of these different obelisks, creating this nomadic and changing ephemeral city on top of a city. And here are some speculative drawings of how that might work. This is around Piazza Navona. And so the balloon, the dome that I decided to focus on is the Tempietto, one of the smallest domes in Rome. And actually right around the corner from the Academy. So I made this full-scale Tempietto dome, which is basically about 15 feet in diameter. But it's a hemisphere, so it was actually by far the largest dome I made and quite a beast to handle, even though and I discovered many things along the way. So this is the dome within my studio on top of the table. The idea, again, kind of you take this dome, you put it inside, it's all puffed. How do you make it? So in order to make it, I had to figure out a number of things. With the balloons, if I had just made it a kind of hemisphere, without the oculus on top, it would just blow up into a sphere, right? Or something as round as possible. So like the disc domes that I made, I had to make a series of internal tufts that would kind of hold the wall thickness of the dome, at least at certain points, and then it would expand in others. So in making this dome, it was actually kind of like drawing the dome because it was full scale and I had to piece it together. But when you inflate a balloon, it shrinks down a certain size. So then I had to do this kind of loose estimating, which is why the Tempietto dome is full scale, but only plus or minus 15%. So I scaled it up about 20% and decided to use some of Borromini's geometry, but again, using totally low-tech materials. So for the tufts, I used just white tape in a cross form that basically had holes behind them so that I would tie rope that would then become this kind of internal net within the dome. That's kind of hard to explain, but maybe you'll see. So this is the dome kind of laid out on my studio floor. It's obviously folded in half. There are like basically 4 layers of plastic. And when you inflate it, you can see here that the rope goes into tension, and that's ultimately what ends up constricting the form of the dome. So I couldn't really know what it was going to look like or work like until I inflated it. And so it was a really big surprise because, when you translate like a compressive structure made out of compressive materials into one that's really tensile, it of course doesn't work the same way. So this dome completely like was, you know, like kind of a pile on the ground. And so in order to kind of open it, I made a ring on the top and a ring on the bottom. And so the form had to have this kind of scaffold in order to really create the hollow hemisphere within. So this is, you know, a kind of conference dome in a way, and you know, the working table exceeds it. And this, you know, here are a couple of people. This is, you know, kind of at the end of my stay in Rome. There were a lot of just objects and elements and drawings I had made, so it was kind of like an open place for people to come and talk. So this is, I'm going to end my presentation on this. There are other projects that I have, which, I mean, I could also talk about, but these were the ones that I felt kind of showed not just like a kind of narrative arc, but also related to a lot of the summer work that we did. But in reality, a number of my projects have different starting and ending points. So like currently I'm working on a couple of building projects, but they're really more historic projects. So I'll leave this at this, and you guys can ask questions, because this now concludes the American Institute of Architects Continuing Education Program. Yeah? Okay, I'm happy to repeat any questions. If you have any questions. Sure.
You studied the different elements in Rome, and I think it's even true in some of the other generative studies that you've done. Did you ever try to attempt to bring any of these elements together as kind of exquisite corpse, or did you always set out to kind of look at them as individual elements that you would explore, such as that?
Okay, so the question is, when I was in Rome, I looked at a series of elements. Did I ever try to combine them into hybrids as a kind of exquisite corpse, or did I always just look at them on their own? That's a great question. I definitely, a lot of the elements are, you know, the way in which I had to create them as an element required detaching them from their other body, or kind of, you know, for example, even like the vendor spaces. Like a lot of those were kind of composites of larger forms and smaller forms. So I think the act of even finding them and identifying them was one that was pretty surgical. And I did really think about combining them, but actually in the end it was more like with the table and the dome and a series of drawings, thinking about combinations that work together but retain an identity. I think the translation that's more synthetic happens in kind of, for example, more of the material transformations, or translating geometry, you know, kind of, yeah, basically traced geometry from, you know, one, like a kind of the interior of Borromini's dome, to a graphic that then becomes an inflated geometry. So I do think a lot about composites, and actually Exquisite Corpse is something like, we played Exquisite Corpse over the summer because joinery is really important to my work. And so, but the ways in which joinery occur vary. So in some, they're kind of composites or chimeras where there's a retention of an identity, like for example in the furniture hills, where it's really like a hill and a furniture piece, or the animals, where there's always kind of two clear animals, even though those forms dissolve. But some joinery is more like tiling. So I think kind of the question of joinery is one that I think about a lot, but I don't have only one answer or like way to do it. I was not, no, alas, although I was there with a really wonderful group of people. I was there in 2011 to 12, and I think Carl was there. Yes, we have a whole kind of Homo sapien group over here. Yeah.
I'm curious about, this reflects mainly on some of the things that you were saying with your characters and their ability to say something about underdevelopment and narrative. I'm curious what your definition of is environment, that each of these ways of looking at the work and different types of work changes the attributes that you pick up on in terms of what the piece is saying about its environment or what it can do.
Yes, I think it definitely changes. So a lot of it is, like I kind of think of there are two main questions I ask myself a lot when approaching design. One is like, what can this do? Like, how does it work? But then the other question could be like, how does this work? How does this work in the world? Or how does the world it comes from work? So there's like corollaries, but for some of the more like open-ended objects, the ambiguous objects, in a way, you can read them many ways. And that's part of, like, for example, that's some of the qualities that I found very desirable of, like, some of these ambivalent objects, that they did have multiple readings, like the way that, for example, some of these totemic, like Native American totemic figures have multiple meanings as kind of iconic forms, but kind of like poetic forms, too. So I think when it comes to the environment that it creates or comes from, I think is quite open to narrative. And so, like, for example, with the critters or the Pantheon, you know, there's this kind of dry way of talking about them that's like also totally bogus, I think. But like, you know, in many ways, they're just, like, for example, the critters, they're outer forms. They don't have any interior, like, composition. Right there. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think I do. I think my answer is yes. I think it changes. Yeah.
So you're going through the process of making this film. Did you try to limit yourself in the materials that you used in creating it, or was it kind of using, for like the rope or the different tapes out of necessity, or more just like allowing them to interact together?
Yeah, so I was, I knew I wanted to make it out of thermoplastic, which is basically, you know, kind of this like very lightweight plastic that you heat seal. So the metallized ones, which were all of the balloons I made earlier, I liked the metallic quality. I liked that they could reflect. I liked that when they were fully inflated, they almost seemed like metal pieces, even though they were soft. For this dome, I actually did really want to try a different materiality. And I chose the clear thermoplastic, one, because it's stronger. It's actually, the metallization process makes the tear factor a lot higher for the balloon foil as opposed to the unmetallized foil. And because it was such a big dome, I knew, you know, my craft, I think, is okay, but like maybe not so okay that there would be no holes in that. So I chose like a stronger material. And then because it was clear, I wanted to make the internal structure something that had a concept and an integrity of its own as well. So for all of the metallized domes, or all of the metallized balloons, the internal tuft is also just the same material that I heat seal as a kind of link inside. But you have no, you know, you have no way of seeing that. So it's really like for this, the rope actually ended up not being a great idea because it was this kind of naturally made twine that had all these little fibers, so like ended up eroding the strength of the thermoplastic. So that was kind of a bummer, given that it took so long to make it. But as I said, the kind of longevity of balloon, you know, it's like not that long. So Yeah, I thought a lot, like I knew tape worked really well. You can't pierce it with anything because then, because of its tear strength, it'll just rip. So I was limited by a number of constraints. And so that's why I decided on these materials. But I did a number of prototypes. I did a number of smaller tests to see how it would work, to make sure that the rope would go into tension and would kind of constrain the form. But my prototypes were like, 4 feet by 4 feet, Yeah.
I'm thinking about maybe some of the students that are here today that are first-year students just starting out in visual communications or basic design. And the critters that you showed set up a kind of really nice relationship of where they're probably struggling or wrapping their heads around orthographic projection and looking at a face and another face and how those move through. And so I was just curious about, like, your work is incredibly restrained in those instances where it's only subtractive. It's only one way of working. And so maybe just speaking about your desire to look at one technique or one approach and to play that out, maybe what you would say to beginning design students who see a whole wealth of options and approaches and the doors wide open, and
Sure.
how you might use that constraint.
Yeah, so I mean, constraints are really, really helpful. And for example, when thinking about, I'm just going to go back to, for example, one of these critters. So a lot of the effort goes into designing just the profile, right? So just the profile that you're then going to extrude. And here, this object is extruded only in 2 axes, but it's by controlling the technique and changing only small varieties, like for example, the curving of a shape versus like only straight shapes, you start to get a lot of surprising variety. So I do think, this is only intersection, Boolean intersection. That's it. I did do a series that I thought of as vaults, which were kind of the void of these forms in a solid, but they're actually much less legible. They're much less apprehendable as a void. So, here, like for example, these are all cubes because then it's kind of equivalent to start with, right? So like each shape has to fill the entire square as much as it can. Otherwise, then you also start to get little appendages that get cut off. So I think, like with these, they are very simple, actually, right? But I find them to be totally surprising, and you can't really predict the 3-dimensional sculptural quality of one of them until you make it. So I would suggest, again, thinking about the elements that you're using. So if you're using a profile, how do you control the profile? The operations that you're using. For example, these are all extruded normal or perpendicular. But like, for example, the wall system that I showed, that was all about extruding obliquely. And the variation was only in how oblique do you go, right? And then maybe the size of them being for different kinds of inhabitation. So I do think it's pretty easy to get something that's complicated. And complicated usually means, for me, like a lot of extra geometry or parts. But things that I find to be very complex are actually oftentimes quite simple, quite simply made. And I think their complexity sometimes stands upon the fact that they're apprehendable in more than one way, right? So like, it's not just like, oh, it's one thing, it's clearly this thing, but there's this kind of ambiguity that's still like strong, right? Like these, I think, have very clear dispositions, especially if looking at them as kind of a normal elevation. But when they're, when you look at them at an angle, they're quite quixotic. So I think constraining is just like, in a way, every variation could be its own world. And I do really like exploring those variations.
So I want to thank Angie for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
So the exhibition opens tonight. It seems like there might be another class that's starting in here soon. And I also